Great. Well, I just wanted to say welcome to everyone. My name is Janine Coleman. I'm the Executive Director of Origins Council and one of the co-principal investigators on this Legacy Cannabis Genetics People and Their Plants, a community-driven study. And excited to be joined here by my colleagues, and in particular, Dr. Dominic Corba, who's presenting today. We are going to have some space for Q&A, and I'll let Dominic talk about how he's going to format his presentation. But if you could please stay on mute until we get to the Q&A, and then use the raise hand function if possible. If you call in, just let us know, and we'll keep a stack in terms of fielding your Q&A. We also have a Q&A feature open in the Zoom. And again, we're recording, and we'll put the recording up on our website probably by tomorrow. So folks that couldn't join us can plug in that way. And with that, I'm happy to pass it to you, Dominic.
Great. I'm going to share my screen now. We're aiming for about a 40-minute opener presentation. I might go a little bit shorter to allow for a little more Q&A at 20 minutes or 25 minutes. So remember, in the Q&A section, it might be good to jot down your questions as I go along. So here we go. Okay. All right, so move things around just a little bit.
I apologize, y'all. Apologies.
I don't know what you're apologizing for, but I think it's okay. All right, our lovely logo. I've included the couple of slides from the overall presentation just to introduce my subscope. It is part of an ecology of scopes that make up the whole project. So, as you may or may not know, this is a project that is funded by the Department of Cannabis Control, but just as importantly, it was a response to a research priority. And we were awarded the money to do this, split amongst everyone in 2023. The overall project is here, and we're joined by a number of our project members. And this is on here for the record. And today's presentation is about, in particular, my subscope. As a reminder, this is a series. We had the overview one, and then we're going to have the other subscopes, December 6th, 20th, 17th, and 31st. And we have a website where you can kind of keep track of things. So I'm going to start out by introducing myself. I am an assistant professor at Cal Poly Humboldt, housed in the Department of Sociology, although my PhD actually is in geography. And my PhD actually was about the political economy of the drug war in Bolivia on coca cultivation. I'm the co-developer and program lead for the Cannabis Studies major, and we now have a minor at Cal Poly Humboldt. I am the co-editor, along with Dr. Josh Mizell, of the Routledge Handbook of Post-Prohibition Cannabis Research, published in 2022. And I am the founder and executive director of the Center for the Study of Cannabis and Social Policy, which was my main position before arriving here about 3 years ago, rejoining academia. So key background information, the professional credentials tell you one thing. I have 15 years of field experience doing research, activism, and community organizing in and with and as part of cannabis communities, especially on the West Coast, Washington State and Northern California primarily, but on the West Coast more broadly. And then also I've done some things nationally and globally. But in terms of what we're doing here, what is especially relevant is that prior work really culminated in being asked to lead cannabis equity assessments across California, 7 distinct counties and cities, as well as consulting on the San Diego County Equity Assessment, in which interviewing people, doing ethnographic interviews about the social context of community formation and the impacts of law enforcement were quite central. And those are not the same as the actual cannabis equity programs that ended up happening, but that was how the money got funded in the first place. So I met a lot of people and really got to know, communities across California in this process. Okay. Oop. Looks like, okay, there we go. So my roles on the project, we're going to be talking about really my role as the subscope investigator, but I want to be clear that, as principal investigator, this is an institutional designation. So I am professionally responsible for the project to the funding institution and the awarded institution, Cal Poly Humboldt. However, this project is a horizontally organized project. We work together to make decisions and come to a consensus about them, about the overall project. So it's really important to be able to make space for representing this, to the institutional checkpoints. My leadership involves acknowledging and making space for co-leadership. I just want to make sure everyone is clear about that, and that is also part of the CBPR methodology that ties the project together. I will also be feeding back on co-editing and finalizing project-wide deliverables and other collectively organized responsibilities, among some other things. But today's talk is about my subscope. I have the lead responsibility for designing, implementing, and completing the political geography subscope methodology and deliverables. So let's talk about those. My subscope really is a response to parts of the DCC research priority that they published, that we wrote the grant for. And they aren't exclusive to my subscope, but the ones that really especially pertain to it involve asking for a narrative history and stories of the individuals associated with the creation and preservation of cannabis genetics in California. And also, importantly, and this was what intersects with the experience on the equity assessments, the proposal should review how the prohibition and criminalization of cannabis cultivation impacted the overall findings of the research, including but not limited to the diversity of cultivars and breeders. Mine is a broad context where the individuals and their stories help create stories about the places and their relationships to each other, and we'll get more into that in a moment. So the objectives of my subscope are to explain the development of California as a modern legacy world historical cannabis place, approximately 1960s to the present, and to situate that history in the context of cannabis eradication and prohibition. And together to represent California's modern legacy in a way that understands, affirms, and respects the legacy of other cannabis places, including their experiences of cannabis eradication and prohibition. And we will unpack that a little bit as we go along. Obviously, California is not the only legacy cannabis place in the world, and the genetics that got here came from other places and other peoples at different points in time. And so how we do this needs to, make space and respect what has come before and where. Going back to, Central Asia quite some time ago, right? So in that way, it's a modern approach to ethnobotany, right? Ethnobotany is the study of people and plants, and it's usually a very sort of deeply historical thing, relying on archaeology and so forth, or the written record. And what we have the opportunity to do actually in California right now is actually not rely on archaeology, but listen to the people who lived through it while they're still alive, and many have passed, obviously, right? So how do I meet those objectives? Well, there are two deliverable articles. that are to be published in open source peer-reviewed academic journals to be decided later. And they have two related themes, right? Placing California cannabis legacy in a world historical context. So connecting flows of California plants and plant people from other older global legacy plants, people, and places. I would say that not just older ones, but ones that also developed around the same time, like Amsterdam, right? And again, I encourage you to ask what that means if that's not super clear to you right now. And then, within that article, we're connecting California's cannabis history with cannabis history, right? Especially the modern globalization of eradication and policing, but also political, cultural, and economic developments like economic globalization. There shouldn't be an and there, sorry. And the globalization of counterculture, which is a super huge part of this story. And then for the other article, it's a different scale. Instead of California and the world context, over the same time period, different California regions in the California story. So we want to get to the diversity of cannabis history and communities within California. And I apologize for just having three regions here. But for example, from Humboldt to Santa Cruz to San Diego, right? North to south. Obviously, those are not the only ones, but they're meant to go north to south. With obviously we're north of the Inland Empire and Sacramento in this text, but those are not excluded, right? Nevada County as well, right? It's a historical geography that centers places and communities, not individuals, but you can't interview places, right? And you can't interview like a community, just one. The stories that the individuals tell and their life histories actually serve as the ways that we get to synthesize, stories about places, communities. It's tied a bit more closely in context with, key developments like the creation of camp, urban drug war policing, Prop 215, SB 420, Prop 19, various local ordinances, and the lead up to Prop 64. So, each of these moments created certain kinds of push and pull factors for people, right? And so if people don't get to that as they tell their stories, then I ask about it, right? So 2 articles, right? And I apologize if this is a little repetitive, but I want to go, very closely from slide to slide. Each article has essentially a research question, right? How, when, and where in California were communities formed around the stewardship of cannabis genetics, which include breeding and cultivation, as well as sharing within communities, right? And across communities. And then when and where in the world did California plant stewards connect with other places in terms of genetics development and plant stewardship? And I have a parenthesis here, which is, making this sentence really long, but it matters. Holding and distributing plants in more than commercial contexts. So the stories I want to hear about are really, how social values and contexts mattered and not just market values, right? And these could include, medical cannabis caregiving, for example. And so for both questions, I'm asking about social conditions that shape the choices people made, with a particular focus on the impacts of law enforcement. How do I answer the questions? Well, there's preliminary research that has been done and is ongoing, which is, consulting what other people have written before, right? Cannabis Evolution and Ethnobotany by Clark and Merlin is a really good and foundational book that is about this and is primarily like with really deep history and focuses on botany quite a bit. but there is also social history and those contexts in it. Articles, for instance, there have been articles written about the historical geography of cannabis, right? And this is an example of one. High points in historical geography of cannabis. And then as well, reviewing publicly available media, including archived radio and podcasts. So, for example, Cannabis Connection from Santa Cruz, hosted by Christopher Carr, had actually quite a lot of interviews talking about the history of genetics and from the people who work them. And of course, there's Hash Church every Sunday for an enormous amount of time, going on for a really long time now, hosted by Bubble Man, Marcus Richardson. So that's, getting at people's stories as they told them themselves, but it's already been recorded. That's what makes them secondary sources. I.e., I did not have any part of producing that data. It's out there for consultation and reference. But my subscope is primarily about the development of primary sources, which is the ethnographic interviews, with the plan to have about 100 distinct ones. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. What are ethnographic interviews? This is different from oral history interviews, but there are similarities in terms of what you want to try to get at in terms of people telling about their lives and life histories. My ethnographic interviews are semi-structured. You don't go in with all the questions that you know you're going to ask, because everyone's life is different. And so you have questions prepared in your back pocket, but you want to let let the people's individual experiences kind of shape where the questions go, right? Like, you don't want to ask someone who you're talking to about Amsterdam about the effect of Prop 215, right? For example. Ethnographic interviews engage communities to tell and also co-analyze their diverse stories to see what they have in common and how they're different. Ethnographic interviews do not create a final word on things. The people that the sampling protocol, like, you're not going to get to everyone who did it. So clearly there's a sampling issue. You're not going to get everyone, and if you did get everyone, like, how to tell all of their stories, that would be usually a life work. We want to see what they have in common and how they're different to begin to construct a history that's an opening point for other people, or maybe myself, or other researchers, for building and revising diverse histories rather than closing the book on the story. Ethnographic interviews are particularly useful for telling stories about historically illegible people. So people who've had to hide for some reason, or whose voices haven't been heard, or who have been socioeconomically marginalized, and they don't usually get to tell their stories. Other people do. And in this case, obviously, outlaw communities and illegal lives are what we're getting at, which is why the ethnographic interviews are useful. The other part of it, and this is what human geography shares with anthropology and other interdisciplinary fields that use ethnographic interviews, is that they're generally practiced by researchers who make a point of living in and with the communities they study, not researchers who parachute in to communities to study them. This means there is definitely a bias, right? I'm not coming into this, as a pretended objective person, right? That doesn't share values and history with many of the people that I interview. The traditional anthropologist goes and lives in Madagascar for 3 years in order to be able to write about the people in Madagascar, right? They don't drop in, distribute a survey that they created beforehand, and then analyze the results quantitatively. This is a way of getting at, like, the messiness of real life, and getting to it and trying to make sense of it. So that's what ethnographic interviews are. So what we're looking for in interviewees, I just want to be clear that, it's not just sort of like everybody who's ever been involved with the plant or smokes weed, right? We are looking for individuals that have a life history that intersect with breeding, cultivation, and plant stewardship, broadly defined. We're looking for people whose lives were deep in places, right? Part of community formation, development, and support contexts. So like medical cannabis caregiving is an example. People who are nodes in networks of plant stewardship, carriers and distributors of plant stewardship within and outside of California. So, key people who held CBD genetics, developed and held CBD genetics and sent the seeds from one place to another or distributed clones and so forth is another good example. We are looking for a diversity of representation of communities across California and demographically. So people from different cultural contexts. As much as the hippies are well represented in the general understanding of how this stuff happened, it wasn't all hippies, right? And it wasn't all people who could be, described as having singular cultural identities either. And so, culturally speaking, urban communities, Black and brown communities are important. Women, we want to get a diversity of voices. And then, of course, across the landscape, not just in Humboldt, for example, right? And generally helpfulness with respect to understanding the impacts of cannabis eradication and prohibition. And what does that mean? Well, we want to get at, again, overall, what was the impact of cannabis prohibition and eradication, and people who did not experience, much of it may not be able to share much about it, but they might also not understand how it shaped what they were doing, explicitly. So that's something we can get at in conversation. My ethnographic interviews, and now we're going to really describe, what they are and how they happen, right? They're identified in three ways, from the archival research, from the network of people I've developed over 15 years and the conversations we've been having about the subject at hand. One of the things that, is ethnographic about this is that these are fun conversations for me and hopefully for everyone that I talk to, because they're not that unlike conversations that people have in the community. We probably be doing them regardless of whether there was the concept of this grant going on. And then also from people recruited by the community advisory boards guiding the rest of the project. How do I accumulate interviews once people are recruited? A snowball rolls downhill, and so within people who do ethnographic interviews, often it's the people you talk to then suggest other people, often quite strongly, as candidates for interviews. And so as we go along, we follow those threads as best we can. So we use prior interviewee recommendations and referrals to find other interviewees. I will say that in the case of this project, interviewees may snowball from public presentations like this webinar. We certainly had a few that emerged from the launch event and folks that were there. It does slow down towards the end to accommodate people, plants, and places that seem underrepresented so far in the interviews. So this is kind of the boring part, but I want to follow Todd's excellent example in his oral history stuff by describing what happens. so there's no surprises. We discuss the objectives of the research interviews with potential interviewees. This webinar is doing that, and so there's kind of a one-to-one variation of that. We do want to review informed consent protocols, right? And get the informed consent form signed. So that's reviewing legal risks of talking about illegal activities, describing we want to describe to people, how the recording works, how the transcription works, and how files are secured. We want to describe the anonymization process and alternatives if people are, if they express an interest in not necessarily being anonymous, right? Which doesn't mean that their names end up in it, but it does give a little more freedom in terms of the choice to represent their stories in the final product. Interviewees may review and edit transcripts before finalization. We don't want to be working from transcripts that people ultimately go back and are uncomfortable with because, during the interview, they may be in a flow and they may go ahead and throw things out there that they may later think about, like, well, maybe I don't want that person's name. Maybe, there's something here that's just a little too revealing. And ultimately, we want to work with the material that people are comfortable with. And there is a $100 gift card stipend for participation. So this is all the preliminary talk, and then we schedule the 90-minute interview, right? The interview itself, right? What does semi-structured means? It's led by people, how people respond to the first question, followed by what they think is important. But there are common contextual questions I ask if they don't come up. The first question is a variation on how and where did you meet the plant? And so that's an invitation to talk about one's social and geographic background and the cultural context for how they came to realize, that cannabis isn't just the first thing they consumed, as well as for folks who weren't born into it, right? How they came to cultivate, right, or breed. As we go along, I ask people to think about social contexts, which it's the set and setting of their journey with the plant. I'm going to use set and setting because I believe that's a widely understood metaphor for how people experience things differently, right? So how you experience your any drug once you consume it. This goes back to, I think, Leary, but cannabis is one of them, right? That affects and influences how you actually experience it. So people have different experiences, often with, maybe even the same cultivar, right? This is going to be the case. People are going to have different experiences with the same context. They may have experienced the financial crisis of 2006, 2007 differently, right? So, as I go along, I do want to try to keep things on track and ask common contextual questions so I can get, differences and commonalities. So asking after specific cultural contexts, if you were, grew up in the barrio or the hills or the inner city, or how significant political and economic events may have shaped their journey, like Prop 215 or the financial crisis I just mentioned, right? The location of the interviews are on Zoom, as well as in person if convenient, if that's what's requested. I will begin to start scheduling trips to different areas so that I can do in-person interviews with people. It is audio recorded if it's not on Zoom. What happens after that is transcription, which combines using AI software, transcription software. They give us a rough cut, and I have funded student assistants from the grant that assist with cleanup of the transcripts. And shout out especially to my senior student assistant, my graduate assistant, Caleb Chen. I have actually about a half a dozen other undergraduates and one other graduate student, Ya Rainier from Mendocino, on the team as well. So we review, we make slight edits. We want to flag names and statements that may need protection, as well as particular geographies, places and times. It's the beginning of kind of coding a little bit. We offer the opportunity for the interviewee to review, right, and to edit their statements, or flag areas of concern, or redact, material, as I mentioned earlier. It's available if needed or desired. Unlike the oral history interviews, ultimately, these transcripts are not publicly available without the permission of the interviewee. Generally speaking, if the interviewee desires the transcript and wants to, use it to help tell their own story, then that's up to them, right? Transcript files will be securely stored for 3 years and then deleted. The finalized transcripts will be analyzed to write the articles. So again, commonalities and differences across time and space. The estimated timeline, it's in process now. We've got about 22 distinct interviews completed. We want to complete our interviews by September 2025. We want to analyze and draft both articles by April 2026 and submit articles for publication by July 2026. When they appear, again, in open source, peer-reviewed journals, open source is important because that means everybody gets to see them. They're not behind a paywall. And usually, the pace of journal submissions, and depending on the journals that we choose, it may happen up to 6 months later. So the overall contribution of this subscope, right? I like to use the word ovular. People use seminal often. And I just learned from basically my supervisor in graduate school that it's fun to say ovular instead. Ovular contribution to academic cannabis studies research literatures. The articles model ways to think about global ethnobotanical cannabis legacies as connected across time and space. We want to, put in the academic literatures, we want to place California cannabis in a modern historical context. We want to represent the perspectives of people who lived that history and not have other people tell their stories for them. We want to connect cannabis history with California and global history. Cannabis history is not something that just happened in a bubble without other things happening. And so it's been omitted from histories of things. And we want to begin to write that in, right? And then, we combine with the other subscopes that the future webinars will be talking about, right? Where all three together represents the first of its kind collaborative study. I do want to make sure that we understand this subscope, right? And those articles may provide cultural history that could be used for petitions for appellations. This part of the subscope does not directly support individual intellectual property claims, just to be fully clear, right? These are collective stories. All right. So we're pretty much on track here. This is the part I'd like to open it up to conversation. So time to ask now, or you can contact me at that email address. And before we do the questions, our next one is Friday, December 6th, the third webinar, and it's about CVPR. And I have both a text and an image of that. So I want to make sure that's happening. All right. I think I'll unshare the screen and open it up to questions. Lucas. Oh,
Hi,
Janine,
hi.
you
Oh, sorry.
go ahead, Lucas. Sorry.
Oh, good. Hi, I'm Lucas. I'm located in Germany at the moment, and we are dealing with the part legalization and stuff like this. So I was interested, you were talking about Amsterdam. Do these studies also involve then people from Amsterdam that just hold also everything built on indoor genetics, or?
No, so let me be really clear about that. There were some folks from especially Santa Cruz, California, that went to Amsterdam in the mid to late 80s. And they brought with them genetic building blocks that actually were used then by the breeders in Amsterdam to build their seed banks. And so these were genetics developed outdoor, not clonal, but clonal kind of came in about that same time. And the seed banks then actually, the genetics flew around the world, but they came back to California. It's really important that actually a lot of the stuff in California kind of came back from Amsterdam after going through what was going on in Amsterdam. But originally, botanically, a great deal of that came from hybrids that were developed in Santa Cruz in particular. You think about skunk and haze. So it's, when I talk about Amsterdam, that's what I mean. There were other places where those genetics went. Switzerland for a brief amount of time, but also, of course, Spain and Barcelona became an important part. And again, plenty of genetics were coming in, not just the California ones, to get in the mix. But there was a continuous genetic flow, between different places. You get, for the example, the famous example from Spain is the CBD genetics that came over to California, in addition to CBD genetics that were starting to get discovered because of testing here and form the basis for a lot of the CBD genetics that we have. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yeah, awesome. It makes total sense.
Next question. Anybody want to know what I mean by world historical context? While you guys are figuring it out. Todd, you do?
I do. I was going to just ask you about that.
All right.
Because it goes right to also what Lucas was just asking too in that previous
Totally.
discussion.
Yeah. So, cannabis evolved on the Himalayan plateau, right? Quite some time ago, and was domesticated in that area. Over 8,000 years ago, right? Our earliest record is about 8,000 years. 10,000 years ago, because it's 8,000 BCE. How did cannabis get from there to the rest of the world, right? Once we get to recorded history, we have a history of empires that stretched, from across from what we call the Middle East today to, the Pacific, China. So cannabis genetics were flowing along trade routes. And often what empires and empire periodizations tell us are about these core periphery relationships where like the trading nodes where cannabis went and then went to the other side of the empire, right? So you think about the Mongol Empire, the Islamic Empire, the Roman Empire, and so forth, right? Cannabis traveled with trade, right? And so the history of how cannabis globalized is really the history of trading and the shifts from one empire to another. So the ancient history of it goes, Central Asia to the west and then to the south down to India and the southeast, and then across the Indian Ocean to Africa, but also across the Middle East to North Africa. As hemp, as we know it, obviously, to what we know now as Europe. But when we get to, what's called the age of discovery, the age of colonialism, right? We know cannabis seeds came across through the slave trade, right? As early as the 1500s. We know that once the British took over India, right, and kind of ran it into the ground, they started exporting Indian labor around the world as indentured servants. And they went to South Africa. They went to the Caribbean. So you had genetics that were here in this side of the hemisphere, but then Indian genetics come. You have the Panama Canal being made at the end of the 19th century. And so then you got whatever trade was going through the Panama Canal, including from Southeast Asia. So the potential for essentially Southeast Asian genetics to have arrived here in 1900 in Panama and mixed with the Indian genetics and the genetics from prior happen. And then you have, as we go along, these former peripheral trade routes become kind of centers, right? Morocco becomes a center of cannabis plants and people in the 20th century, right? But a little bit earlier than California. So, all of this leads up to, that moment in, the early 1970s in particular when, the counterculture was, traveling the hippie trail, right? And bringing genetics back from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and all, Lebanon. And then you also had, obviously, from Mexico and from Colombia and Jamaica. And so like the earliest cannabis breeding that was done here was done in connection with what was a globalization happening essentially, right? With the key context of the modern situation from the 1970s being the beginning of the funded drug war, which involved, cannabis eradication and policing. And in terms of the funding that went into that, actually, the vast majority of it was coming from the United States, and the vast majority of that was actually going to California. So how does California become a legacy cannabis place as almost like the last stop on cannabis's world tour and from Central Asia to the present, right? It's probably not the last stop, but it's the one that happened, at the time when global policy was trying to eradicate, would do ecocide. Like cannabis has no medical use and everybody's got to eradicate it, right? And so it really kind of explores that contradiction and how that happened. So California genetics are global genetics. They're not just California ones, right? From the start. Sam?
Yeah, thank you, Dominic. I was going to ask, I'm just curious how, you are conducting the interviews in a way that, really honors the people, plants, the history as far as legacy communities are concerned. Obviously, I grew up in Mendocino County, cultivated for almost 20 years and grew up with, generational legacy farmers. And I've seen a lot of these folks that have brought genetics from Amsterdam and from the Kush Valley and all kinds of crazy places. Israel and really, really, wild places. And I'm just curious, how it's kind of a twofold question. One is how you honor those community members and how you conduct things in a way that you feel is the most honorable to the legacy, the community, and the history there. And then also, how you handle stories that are differing from those different communities, because, there's so much, he said, she said, all that kind of stuff when it comes to the history of genetics, right? So appreciate all the work, man.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's a really important question. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, but didn't expand on, which is that this is not an attempt to close the book on history. We want to acknowledge essentially that, people had different experiences and memories of what happened, and that, even people's memories can, evolve over time. in certain ways. So we want to offer the range of possible things that happened, right? And those can be built on further or verified further and later, but present the range of experiences without making a definitive judgment call and saying, no, this is how it happened. This person had it right. The focus is on, the dynamics of history as complicated, especially if you're not there right now firsthand, even for the people who are able to talk about it later. So we want to honor people's different memories as well, and kind of leave the struggle over closing the book, or I don't think you'll ever be able to close the book, right? But revising, right? Any history of anything always goes through a revisionary phase, at some point, right? A history is written, and then someone comes back and says, no, I talked to these other people, and this needs a little more nuance and context. So there's approaching and representing the stories with humility is what it comes down to. This is quite different from what I would call, positivist research that seeks to generalize, its findings in a way that displaces all other findings that came before, right? This engages with the messiness of life and human experience. So that can be the case, across decades or even across, the same place as well. So it's really about making clear in the articles as well the limits of generalization, right? But to really characterize this as a beginning. It hasn't been done before in this way, it hasn't been tried before, but here's a way to do it. And it's an invitation to, for other people to have the space to disagree. I think that's critical because, no one person is going to get it right, but really to the outside world that's going to read this, like the DCC or people who are making policy in other places, it's on the record at this point that this is possible, and that maybe they need to, ask the people in their own backyards about their history, right? Preserve it. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Well, the important thing about these webinars is obviously not just sort of the live Q&A, but if something occurs to you or has occurred to you later on, it's important that you feel free to reach out to me, right? Sam?
Sorry about that. Went for the mute button and had a call come in. So one follow-up to that question, and thank you so much for that answer. That was awesome. Is that, given the number of interviews that you're conducting and the time that we have, what I mean, over the next year to not only see the CAB be built out, the community advisory board, and also the research subjects and interviewees, there's much consensus to be had, I assume, as far as this is just kind of in reference to the history and the kind of conflicting histories or overlapping histories as far as stories and communities that have stewarded these genetics, because even somebody might have said, oh, I got this genetic, I swear I had it first. And it's like, oh, well, no, because all of these different people mentioned over here that they, have been stewarding it since this date that was prior in time, right, or whatever. So I'm sure, I'm guessing some of that will be kind of clarified by consensus and the sheer number of interviews, and not having it necessarily be, siloed to one interviewee or one research subject or another, right?
It should help, but let's also be clear that in terms of genetics, right? It all came from somewhere else to begin with. So this is really, really, what is a cultivar? Is a question that, this project can begin to ask and begin to get answered. You know, people have strong feelings about like their cultivar, what makes it theirs, right? If obviously they didn't invent cannabis, right? And that like, you know, most modern genetics come from that mix of global sources from especially, you know, Colombia, Mexico, and Thailand, as well as Afghanistan, Pakistan, right? As well as other places, certainly South Africa, Central Africa. So this kind of connects with that other thing about really putting this in world historical. At what point is, you know, at what point can we relate to a particular cultivar personally? Is I guess how I would say it, right? Clearly there's different, you know, phenotypes, genotypes, and chemotypes that have been happening through hybridization, right? And so they might very well have like their thing and their version of it, and somebody else had another, you know, variation of it. So it does create, I think, a playing field for people to not just disagree, but, you know, come to consensus around what a cultivar means and what like having a cultivar means, right? If you go drill down super deeply, like what is a landrace is a question that is still needs to be answered, quite frankly. We have referred to populations of genetics that come from particular regions geographically for a very long time. And one of the things obviously that California and Amsterdam do is start to call them things besides where they're from, but like where they're from, there's a lot of diversity too. Like there's no single land race from Afghanistan. There are a number of land races, or there's a number of populations, let me say instead. I'm actually trying not to use the word land race actually anymore. But once we're asking those questions, then it's different sort of, it's not he said, she said anymore. It's recognizing actually like how botany works, right? We got Todd.
You know, I already asked my question. Why don't you take William first?
Oh, William.
I know we only have about 5 minutes left.
All right. William? Is there a mute issue on William? No.
William
What-
Dolphin, calling William Dolphin. We see your hand.
This is, by the way, a pretty awesome academic researcher in his own right, William Dolphin.
Yeah, who can't operate the stuff.
Oh, I
We-
hear you.
We hear you
Hey,
now.
you hear me? Oh,
got
now
you.
it didn't. I don't know what was happening with that. It wasn't letting me unmute. Then I got asked to unmute and it still was not responding. Sorry about that. And look, video now works too. Hi. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, super fascinated by all this and this intersection between social history and, as you were just describing, the botanical history, the genetic histories, just really, really interesting. And I know there's a genomic component to this project. I'm just wondering if you could speak to a little bit of the kind of goals and the ways in which that may get integrated eventually. I mean, again, this question about, you know, sort of progenitor genetics, right? I also am not comfortable with the landrace word, but there's all this sort of like searching. We're going up into the hills in the Hindu Kush region. We're going to try to find these legacy plants, and a lot of work in Africa around sort of finding, or even the Project CBD kind of reclamation projects of let's try to do systematic breeding that's going to restore things. But that's obviously quite different than people's stories of how they found specific genetics or their understanding of, you know, my cultivar. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that kind of interdisciplinary piece.
Yeah, and as I respond, let's make clear, I'm not answering for Eleanor, who, you know, the genomics part is coming up, and so there's a lot of this that like we don't even know yet how it's going to connect because we haven't done it yet. And when it comes to genomics, like, you know, predicting things is not predicting what's going to happen is obviously not a thing that we can plan around. But, you know, I would say that like so far from the different approaches to, you know, genomics work, you know, there's a search for clustering, right? And it's the, you know, genomic footprints that cluster that, okay, maybe that means they're related, right? But like there are different ways that like you can arrive at clusters. And one is like, you know, from, you know, history going back, and another is like people using the same genetics that were used years ago to create something, and then it ends up in the cluster, right? So, you know, for me personally and my subscope, right, where I'm at with a lot of that is that I think we have a model of the world that is clouded by the search for sameness, and that we're constantly searching for ways to, you know, represent the world in ways that kind of fix how things are. Like these are all the same, right? And the world is full of difference. And I think it's equally important to platform difference. It's a little bit of a dialectic thing, right? Because like, how do you make sense of the world if you don't settle on, you know, basic language, right? And what words mean? But we also, I think, do ourselves a disfavor by like disallowing the possibility that, you know, our understandings will change and our paradigms will shift. And I think that that's something in general that's happened in society, and certainly, you know, my approach to this is that like, you know, let's talk about difference. You know, that is, you know, a very important way of understanding the world, getting at it to allow for, you know, openings and possibilities, and not create something and then just gets completely overturned later, right? Like you want to make a lasting contribution, you know, not by closing the door, but by opening it. And so I think, you know, to the extent that we will be engaged with Eleanor's work and the work of others, that's going to be my principle. Thank you, Anthony.
It looks like we're coming up on time, Dominic. I am happy to leave it to you, though, if you'd like to extend a little further.
I think we're good. Really appreciate people showing up today, and I really hope that this has been informative and helps, not just you know, so people understand it, but, you know, like I said, as part of the, you know, the snowball. You know, like if folks listening to this want to get a hold of me, it won't necessarily lead to an interview. Cannot guarantee that, but, you know, I'm always good to talk to people about their perspectives on these things. And so I just want to make sure that invitation is clear.
Thank you so much, Dominic. Really appreciate the conversation. Thank you all for joining. And this will be posted to our website probably tomorrow. And then we have our next webinar coming up on December 6th, and that'll be about the community-based participatory research methodology that we're employing in the study. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.